Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about the women who are reshaping our world. Now, to mark International Women's Day, we are focusing on what was clearly the biggest story in France in recent months. That, of course, being the rape trial of Gisele Pelicot, who went on to become a global feminist icon after waiving her right to remain anonymous. A court in Avignon hearing about how for nearly a decade the 72-year-old grandmother had been drugged unconscious by her then husband and offered to more than 80 strangers for sex. But will Gisele Pelicot's extraordinary bravery result in substantive change, especially since currently there is no definition of consent in French rape law? Joining me in the studio today from the Women's Foundation of France is Louise-Anne Baudrier and Clement, the editor-in-chief of the Paris-based feminist newsletter Impact. Thanks to both of you for coming in to speak to us. Megan, let me start with you. As I mentioned there, unlike the US and other European nations, France does not define rape as sex without consent. By contrast, it's rather intercourse committed by violence, surprise, constraint, or threat. What does this mean for prosecuting rape allegations in this country?
Well, more broadly, rape allegations are not very often prosecuted in this country. The data from 2020 showed that 94% of cases of rape were dropped by prosecutors. So we really have a lack of rape prosecution in this country. When it does happen, the conviction rate is about 10 to 15%. Now, that's due to a range of factors, and the main factor that feminist groups point to is a lack of means, a lack of money. But the Pelicot case really did show that there is kind of a lacuna in the French law around consent that does exist in other countries.
Louise-Anne, the Women's Foundation opposes the concept of adding consent to the nation's rape laws. For many women outside of France, this does raise eyebrows. Could you explain why your organisation has taken such a stance?
So first, I would start by saying that it's so important for us to just point out the fact that we need to debate and discuss about consent. It's important for our society, but now we don't believe it's the right answer. We don't see a consensus around the notion of consent here in France within the feminist movement. And we believe it might lead to some risk for the victims themselves.
Could you specify what those risks actually are?
We often speak about secondary victimization, and putting consent in rape law might lead to this, because the prosecutor might have to argue again and again that the victim did not consent, and we might only focus on the victim behavior when we really believe that in rape law we should only focus on the act of the aggressors.
Megan, yet there are numerous French feminists who would disagree with what Louise-Anne and her organisation are saying and would argue that France indeed should follow the lead of other European nations such as Sweden, which has implemented such a law.
Yeah, it's a live debate here, and I think I agree that it's right that we have a debate about consent in France right now. It needs to happen, and it needs to happen not just amongst feminists but amongst the wider community. I think what's really important with these consent laws, which are often described as yes means yes laws, is the wording. And different countries have worded them differently with different results. So we've seen that in Sweden, for example, there has been an uptick in convictions for rape following bringing in a yes means yes law. But a country like Spain, which changed its law to be a yes means yes law, there was unintended consequences where we saw some perpetrators getting out earlier than they would have. And so it really depends on how we word these laws. And some groups say you can word them in a way that does not put the impetus on the victim to prove that they didn't consent, but rather on the perpetrator to prove that they sought it.
Now, at this point, let's just pause as we take a look as to how consent needs to be taught at an early age.
The playground, a miniature world of its own, where already differences emerge and stereotypes are forged. This school in the Greater Paris region is hoping to teach children values of tolerance and respect at an early age. Today, first and second grade students are watching a puppet show about gender equality.
Les enfants, bienvenue dans notre spectacle de marionnettes. Les marionnettes de l'égalité
entre les filles et les garçons.
The concept of personal space, or the role of women in society, themes that are addressed in a playful way with language that's adapted to children. Today's show is about consent.
Je veux pas que tu touches mes cheveux là tout de suite maintenant.
Bah, qu'est-ce qu'elles ont mes mains? Elles puent le vomi des bébés qui coulent et qui puent?
Mais n'importe quoi, elle pue pas le vomi des bébés qui coulent et qui puent. Mon corps à moi, c'est mon corps à moi. Et comme mon corps à moi, c'est mon corps à moi, c'est moi qui décide si je veux qu'on me touche les cheveux, qu'on me fasse un câlin ou un bisou par exemple. Votre corps à vous, il appartient à qui?
À nous.
Exactement. Et donc, qui décide pour vous?
Nous.
C'est vous.
Je peux toucher les
If someone asks to touch your hair, you can say yes or no. And if you don't say anything, it also means no.
En fait, il n'y a aucune raison de pas.
There's no reason not to address these issues as early as possible. We know that violence exists, so we might as well try to prevent it. It's a win-win for society.
Globalement, tout a gagné.
Je sais pas, on a déjà assisté à des...
We've seen instances where, after watching our show, a child points out a situation in which other kids touch someone without asking first. So the message is getting through.
C'est que c'est un message qui passe bien.
Despite the success of these methods, only a few schools choose to address the issue. But that may soon change, as the French government plans to introduce a revised sexual education syllabus covering topics such as consent and gender equality at the start of the next school year.
So, Megan, as we saw there, when it comes to teaching young men and boys about consent, it really needs to start at a very early age, doesn't it?
Yes, and indeed, sexual education of all kinds needs to start very early because we start receiving messages from what we understand as rape culture very early as well. And often the first interaction people have with the idea of sex is via pornography, in which affirmative consent does not really exist. So the earlier the better, in an appropriate way of showing what an equal relationship looks like based on mutual consent.
Louise-Anne, as Megan mentioned there, pornography is really playing a big part in all of this when it comes to talking about consent and sex education and so on. But the reality is that pop music, film, literature still fails to consistently address the notion of consent. But in the wake of the Pelicot case and other very prominent rape trials, are attitudes starting to change?
I believe yes, actually. I believe that during this case, we saw a better understanding of all the French society and maybe even the international community about what actually means rape culture. And now I believe that because of all the discourse we heard by judges, the law enforcement, even the local mayor in the Pelicot case, he said that no one died, you know. And all the person, even the lawyers of all the accused man, they use very strong words on what they believe is rape, and these words they concretize the notion of rape culture. And we saw that in the street. There were many persons in the street in November for last March, and it was very refreshing for us feminists to see all this person dancing, singing, and saying that we don't want that anymore. We see that there is a rape culture. Everyone believe that it exists, so we need to change that.
Now, reporter Sonia Baratello attended a men's circle here in Paris where they talked about their view of consent.
My sex life started by sleeping with a girl that I didn't really want to sleep with. I think because I hadn't really thought about my own desire, my relationship with my body. Was I consenting to my own behaviour? What is my desire really based on? How can I understand someone else's desire if I don't understand my own?
I realized that when it comes to consent, I really hadn't done the work. It was the first time I had a long-term relationship with someone. That's when I realized that I was capable of putting pressure on this girl, who I was very, very much in love with, who didn't want it as much as I did. I put pressure on her because I didn't understand that even though she had given me her consent once, I had to ask her again, every time. It was totally foreign to me. And in fact, I wasn't the one putting that pressure on her. It was a social pressure that I transferred to our relationship, which was that we were a couple, we were in love, therefore we had to screw. And the moment I stopped talking about my romantic relationships to my male friends, I felt totally free of any pressure.
Now, I want to pose a question to both of my guests, and that is, the bottom line is that society needs to urgently address this global pandemic of sexual violence if it truly wishes to pursue gender equality. Is that not right, Louise-Anne?
It's really right. Actually, sexual violence is a very dramatic phenomenon in every country. And here in France, we should continue to talk about consent, yes, but maybe not only talk about put it in a law. We need more change, more means, more resources. And that's why us in the Women's Foundation, we ask the government to actually put more means on the table. And that's why we ask for a comprehensive law with more than 100 measures, very concrete ones. And we believe that that's the change we need.
Megan?
Yeah, I mean, you can't have a functioning society where half of that society is overwhelmingly more likely to suffer sexual violence at the hands of the other half. It's no way to live. And I think what we're seeing in France right now is a moment of reckoning, starting with the Pelicot case, but with the number of cases that we see going on right now about long-term sexual assault against many, many, many people. And I think this is the work of generations. We saw that with the Pelicot trial. If you looked at the ages of the perpetrators, it really went from the 20s to the 70s. There's a whole generations of men who haven't had the conversations that we've seen here in this studio today. They haven't had the education that they need. And so the change starts now, and it will take generations.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to both of my guests, Megan Clement and Louise-Anne Baudrier. And that's it for this edition. So until our next show, bye for now.